So now we're going to do a quick review. This is a partial timeline of biblical history, okay? So our first era, we talked about week 1 is what? Creation. Good. And then the second era, patriarchs. And a patriarch is what? What's the definition of a patriarch? Father ruler, right? Who is our first patriarch? Okay, and who is our second patriarch? Isaac. So we have Abraham, then we have Isaac, and then we have Jacob. And Jacob, at some point, his name is changed to what? Israel. And Jacob had how many sons? And those 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. Those 12 tribes are really going to come into play today in what we talk about. Okay, third era was what? Slavery. Who was enslaved to who? Yep, that's right. Israelites enslaved by the Egyptians, okay? And then from slavery, God sends a deliverer named who? And Moses takes them through the era called the Exodus. And what happens in the Exodus? They exit. Woohoo! I know that's a hard one. Okay, I'm going to get tangled up in this, I'm afraid. So, yes, the Israelites exit Egypt under God's mighty plan using Moses. Okay, let's see here. Sorry, little technical problem. Okay, so after the Exodus, then they're sent out into the desert of Sinai, and God gives them through Moses what? The law. And is that because God was mean? No. They needed to learn how to get along. They needed to learn how to relate to each other and to God. And unfortunately, they didn't do that super well. And so they end up being disciplined by God and sent into this period called the wanderings. And they have to wander around the desert for how many years? To go on a trip that could have been made in 11 days. Okay? So, we have the law and the wanderings, and then we have, did we do this one next week? I was like, so I teach WOW at night, and last night I taught last week's lesson. So I'm kind of like, where are we? So this is when the era of what? The conquest. And who was conquesting what? Yeah, so Israel is being sent by God as the 12 tribes to conquer the people in the land of Canaan to take possession of something that's a key part of the Abrahamic covenant, the promised land. So they're sent to conquer the promised land, all right? So that sets us up for the 3 sections we're going to cover today, okay? And the first one is called, you want to guess? The Judges. All right, so let me give you some backdrop for the Judges. This is interesting. If you guys see me like get really wound up and fall down, come rescue me. Okay, so Joshua, when we pick up here at the era of the Judges, Moses has died and Joshua has become the leader of the people of Israel. They're not yet a nation, but they could be. So, and then Joshua dies, and unfortunately, all the 12 tribes have not driven out the people that they were told to. God told them very specifically, I want this tribe to take this area and drive out this people. But unfortunately, there's been a lot of sin and disobedience with that. And so we have some problems. And Judges is actually a very disturbing era. It's one of the most disturbing eras in the Old Testament. And I'm going to give you lots of disturbing reasons why, okay? So this is where we're picking up. I want to start out, though, by defining a judge. What was a judge in Old Testament times? A judge, we think of a judge as like wearing a robe and making determinations on court cases and executing justice. That's a little bit part of what an Old Testament judge was, but really, contextually, they were more military leaders that are supernaturally empowered by God to do things that they would not normally be able to do on their own. and they're very tribal, very regional in nature. They're not national judges. They're not over all 12 tribes, but they're more like over one tribe. So very regional, very localized, and they tend to be, for the most part, less than desirable model leaders. So I want to tell you up front, don't look to the book of Judges for leadership, okay? No, that would be a very poor example. And when we teach on Judges in a few weeks, you'll learn a lot more about that, okay? So we understand they were more military leaders. Now, we see in the book of Judges, amazingly, what a coincidence, there are 12 miraculous acts of God where he delivers the 12 different unruly tribes through 12 unlikely judges. What are the chances of that happening? But it's kind of interesting. Now, at this point, so when we left off at the end of the conquest, at that point during the conquest, Israel was really being ruled by judges, and they're going to continue to be ruled by judges, but the last one of these is going to be Samuel in this time period. And we're going to talk more about Samuel as we go. But what's happening during this era is that the priesthood is declining into more immorality. Some of you may remember this Old Testament judge named Eli. And Eli's sons were corrupt. They were doing really bad things. So people were coming and complaining to Eli, and he wasn't doing anything about it. And then when Samuel eventually takes over, to some degree, it's the same thing with Samuel. So the priesthood is going into a decline, and this is not good. So what happens, because the priesthood is declining, it makes way for the role of a new leader, a new spiritual leader, and that's the role of the prophet. So we're going to see the decline of the priesthood and the rise of the prophetic role in the Old Testament. Now, there are some themes in this time period. Regression, sadly. Regression. They are regressing more and more into immorality, more and more into idol worship, more and more into doing what the neighboring idol worshiping countries are doing. There's this big word, apostasy. So we see a lot of this in this time period. So a definition of apostasy is abandonment of religious belief or a denunciation of it. So the Hebrews in the past, in their religion, they believed in one God, but because of the influence that they've allowed in part by not conquering the enemy nations and not dispossessing the idol worshipers of their land, now what's happening is they're beginning to adopt some of their ways. So we see a lot of apostasy in this time period. One of the key scriptures that we see repeated over and over again in the book of Judges is, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Okay? So it's become a me first, every man for himself kind of culture at this point in time. Now, some other things I want to mention. So in terms of the books in the Bible itself, they are covered by the book of Judges, but also by this wonderful book called Ruth. And Ruth is really the one bright spot in this era. Ruth is actually a Moabite. She's not a Hebrew. And she ends up marrying a Hebrew, and her father-in-law dies, her husband dies, her brother-in-law dies, and her mother-in-law, Naomi, is left bereft of her husband and her two sons. But Ruth does this absolutely beautiful thing, and her mother-in-law says, hey, go back to your people, go back to the Moabites, go back to your mother's house, go marry again, start over again, have a wonderful life. And Ruth says, no, I'm not going to leave you. Some of you that are older might have been to a wedding where the Song of Ruth is sung. It's a traditional song in the West for weddings where we in the wedding song, we say, for where you go, I will go, where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Well, it's ironic because it wasn't a marriage song. It was Ruth saying this to Naomi. But it's this beautiful act of selfless love. No, your God, the one God of the Israelites, is going to become my God. And wherever you go, I'm going to go. So Naomi goes back to Bethlehem, and Ruth goes with her, and some beautiful things happen. I love the story of Ruth. Now, there's something super important as well. So when we ended the last era, God had said, basically, I don't know if we see this word in Scripture, but basically he says, you're going to be governed as a theocracy. Theo, God, ocracy, I guess, form of government. I'm not a whatever word expert. But he basically says, I'm your God, I'm your leader, you don't need a king. Well, during this era, the Israelites, forget that it's a theocracy and that they are led by God, and they cease to honor God as their king and as their leader. So again, they just keep spiraling down, spiraling down. Now, I want to draw a picture for you guys. So on the back sheet of one of your papers or wherever you have room, draw a big circle on your sheet of paper. You can do it on the back of your judge's chart if you want. Okay? So Judges is known for this cycle that is repeated something like 7 times exactly. Okay? Now, this is how it starts. I have to look at my notes so I don't mess it up. Okay. So it starts with, and ironically, these are all R's again. It starts with man rebelling. Shocker, right? Okay, so man rebels. Basically, God said, don't marry foreign wives because they're going to influence you to worship their idols, and they do it anyway. So they marry foreign wives. They start worshiping the foreign gods. They take little idols in, some big idols into their homes. They even start helping their foreign wives build things like Asherah poles and statues to the god Baal, which is a big, nasty idol back then. So they rebel, and then God responds by retribution. Okay? He disciplines them. It's like, okay, I didn't want to do this, but I'm left to give you the consequences that I told you I would. In Deuteronomy, he was very, very clear about what would happen. He would say, choose the things of righteousness, you choose life, choose sin, and you choose death. Okay? Now, he gives them discipline and retribution, and then man cries out, and man repents, right? Have you ever made a really stupid choice in your life? You knew you were being disobedient to God, and then he responds out of love, as any loving parent would, and he disciplines you, and then you go, oh no, it's too hard, stop. Have any of you ever done that? Oh, come on, am I the only one? Okay, so then man repents, and then God, because he's a God of mercy, restores. Out of compassion and mercy and forgiveness, God restores them, right? And as a result of them being restored and them temporarily behaving and responding well to God, they enjoy rest. Okay? Like I said, unfortunately, they repeat this cycle about 7 times in the book of Judges. So every time they enter a season of rest, eventually they get restless and they start sinning again, and they immediately go back to rebelling again. It's a very, very destructive and sad cycle. So let's look at how we see God reveal himself during this time. Well, in the first place, we see that God he just continues to reveal himself as a covenant God. He honors his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we see this because he's patient, he responds to their repentance, he restores them, he forgives them. And he keeps doing this over and over and over again because they keep repeating this crazy cycle 7 times. So he's patient and he's forgiving. And this is all in keeping with the Abrahamic covenant. We see that God is a God of power. So we see every time we see this cycle repeat itself, God uses this unlikely judge to rise up and conquer and do something miraculous. But we know that the power to do that is not within man himself. It's because of God and the Holy Spirit empowering this unlikely judge to do this miraculous deliverance. Okay? An example of this is Gideon and the 300 men. You guys probably remember that story. If you don't, I'm excited for you to read it in the Bible and find out about it. It's really a fun story. We also see that God does these miracles, but he makes it very clear that the miracles are not about the man that he uses, and in one case, Deborah, a woman. It's not ever about them. It's about him, okay? It's about him. The miracles are only possible. And he makes it so evident because he allows the sin of these judges to be recorded for all of time. He doesn't try to hide that they're pretty sinful, weak, doubtful, doubting people. And in the case of Samson, oh my goodness, Samson had some serious problems, and yet God did some really miraculous things through Samson. So, what do we learn about that? Do we learn from all of that wow, I can do anything I want? It's like if I believe hard enough, I can do anything I want. No. We learned that this was a pretty desperate time, and God didn't have a lot to work with. But he still honored his covenant with Abraham, and he still raised up leaders from weak and sinful people, and he still delivered his people over and over and over again. So we shouldn't be impressed with man. When we teach on Judges, we'll actually talk about Deborah, because there's this whole thing where a lot of women love to take Deborah as the example why women should be able to be senior pastors and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, what you're going to find out during the book of Judges when we teach on that is this is not an era to be taking lessons on leadership and how to justify certain philosophies, okay? But we'll get to that when we teach on Judges. Okay, so rebellion of man, I think it's pretty easy to see in this time period. They compromised all the time. They intermarried with idol worshipers. There was sexual sin that was pretty rampant. They basically, as a people group, they put self and their own individual tribe over a more unified 12 tribes together that would allow them to become a nation. They couldn't become a nation at this point because they were so self-centered. It would kind of be like saying, we live in Idaho and we hate people from Montana, or we hate people from Washington because we're all about being Idahoans. That's not a good thing, right? We're Americans. Now, first and foremost, we're Christians, right? But as Americans, we need to honor all Americans and appreciate all states, even if you're from the Southland. I spent a lot of years in the Southland, so I say that tongue-in-cheek. It's kind of like what we see today between Democrats and Republicans, right? We're all Americans, okay? Let's be kind and respectful. Well, they were anything but that back then. Great disunity. We see just a debasing of people, degenerate actions, this steep and steady decline, violation of covenant in every single way, okay? And then, again, I demonstrated that through this cycle of sin. So how do we see God redeeming redeeming man back to himself? Well, Samuel, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, Samuel is the last judge and priest who's truly a national spiritual leader. And he is going to become the bridge to the next really important era and what will become a very good era in biblical history. But God uses Samuel in a super significant way. We see the redemption of man back to God through discipline. God has to discipline very, very strongly. And the way he typically does it in this era of history is by allowing enemy nations to come in and put a whooping on Israel. Okay? Now, could that be possible for the United States someday? Yeah, it could. Sometimes when bad things happen to the United States, it's because of our arrogance, I believe. And we say, we don't need God. We don't want to worship God. We want in God we trust to be taken off. Well, there's consequences for that. Okay? And then we see the redemption of man back to God most clearly through these 12 judges and deliverers. And then we see it in a beautiful, beautiful way in the story of Ruth. Let me see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, we're doing okay. So Ruth, I have a little bit more time to tell you more about Ruth. So I explained to you how Ruth ends up in Bethlehem with her mother-in-law, Naomi. Well, there's this thing in the Old Testament called kinsman redeemer. Let me see if I can write that up here. Kinsman redeemer. Now, this was a practice in the Old Testament times where if a man dies and leaves a widow and or children, his closest relative has an opportunity then to come in and redeem the family of the man that has died by buying his land, okay, by rescuing the widow and the family from poverty, from sickness, from illness, and basically by marrying the wife, if he so chooses, and gives the wife an opportunity to still have children and continue the family name. Now, it's usually a close relative. They're not obligated to do this, but if they do, it is considered an act of love and mercy. Well, in the story of Ruth, it's so beautiful. She and her mother-in-law, Naomi, are absolutely poor. They've just been devastated by a famine that's been in the land. They've lost everything. And her mother-in-law, Naomi, has just basically said, I have no hope. It's really depressing. But Ruth says, no, let me go out and glean in the fields. Okay, that means that she comes behind the reapers and she picks up what's left over. And from that, she would provide food and resources for her family. Well, enter Boaz. Boaz happens to be a close relative of Naomi's husband that died. And I'll spare you all the details, but it is such a fun read. It's way better than romance fiction. If you want to read romance fiction, just go to Ruth instead. It's way, way, way better. But Boaz ends up redeeming. He ends up exercising his legal rights as kinsman redeemer, and he marries Ruth. And you know what's really exciting? Because of her marriage to Boaz, she becomes the grandmother of David, of King David. Now remember, she's a Moabite. She's not even a Hebrew. But yet, she is in the family line of King David. And who ultimately comes from the line of David? Jesus. Ruth is in the ancestry of Jesus. And again, she's a Moabite. It's such a beautiful story of redemption. Okay, so how does this point to Jesus? Well, I've just told you one really cool way. But the entire era points to sinful man's need for a Savior, need for someone to make a way back to God because they've so lost their way at this point in time. And we know that Jesus is the way. Jesus saves us from ourselves ultimately, right? I mean, I hope that at some point in your life you've gotten in touch with your sin nature and you know, I need to be saved. I'm not going to just point to other people and say, he, she. No, I need to be saved from myself. And Jesus is the answer to that. Samuel, we see Samuel, we talked about type a few times already in our prior weeks, but Samuel is a type. Now, what is so cool, Samuel was the first figure in Old Testament history that was a priest, he was a prophet, he was a judge. Okay, all in one. He's the first figure that's all three of those things. Because remember, we're transitioning from the priesthood to the role of the prophet. Now, what is so cool, he was the first and actually only figure in the Bible until Jesus. Jesus basically becomes the perfect priest, judge, prophet, but also Jesus is king. So Jesus is the one and only figure in the Bible where we see all four of those roles fulfilled, which is so cool. We see tons of imperfection in all these judges. Boy, they are pretty messed up. But Jesus becomes the deliverer for all time. These judges are used in this cycle. When God restores, he uses this imperfect, sinful man or woman, judge, to deliver Israel from their punishment, which is coming in at the hands of their enemy neighbors, right? But Jesus is the deliverer for all time. After Jesus, there's no need for this continued cycle, right? Although I think sometimes we say, oh no, we think roller coasters are fun. Let's just do this again. Let's go around that mountain again. Have you ever gone around the same mountain more than once? Yeah. Guess what? There's an exit plan, and it's called Jesus. All right, we see through Boaz as a kinsman redeemer, we see how he points to Jesus. Basically, as our kinsman redeemer, Jesus is our bridegroom, and he recognizes us as the bride, which is this beautiful act of selfless love. Jesus is our bridegroom. Jesus sees us as our bride. And then through Ruth, we see this loyal love that is demonstrated toward Naomi, right? And it's a beautiful picture of the loyal love that God has for us and was perfectly demonstrated on the cross. So lots of beautiful ways that the era of the judges points to Jesus. Okay, now the next era, I'm going to see if I can rotate this around. I tried flipping it over and it didn't want to flip. So we'll just rotate. Okay, so our next era is called the United Kingdom. So here's what happens, and here's where Samuel comes into play. Can you guys all see that all right? Sorry it's small, but hi. It's kind of fun to peek out from back there. Okay, so Samuel is used by God. So like I said, he's the final judge. He's the priest in this really despicable era. And the people come to Samuel and say, we want to be like all the other nations. Now, all those other nations are idol worshipers, right? They're pagans. They don't worship our one God. They don't believe in monotheism. They're polytheistic, right? Many gods. So they come to Samuel and they say, we want to be like other nations. We want a king. And Samuel's like, oh, no. You don't know what you're asking. You really don't want a king, because a king is going to enslave your people. He's going to start collecting taxes. He's going to build a palace. And it's not going to be a good thing. But they're like, no, we want a king. Samuel goes to the Lord and he's like, God, you're our king. This is supposed to be a theocracy. But no, they don't want a theocracy anymore. They want a monarchy. Okay? They want to look like Queen Elizabeth and now King Charles and Prince William, right? They want to have the royal golden chariot, right? And God says, hey, give them what they want. Just let them have it. So God basically says, let's go with Saul. Now, Saul is the first king of Israel under the United Kingdom, okay? And Saul is a Benjamite, and apparently that means he's from the tribe of Benjamin. Apparently he's really tall and handsome. So he enters our story hiding in the baggage. Yeah, so what does that tell us about his leadership and his courage? Yeah, not so good. But he's handsome. And so God's like, okay, They want this surface solution, so let's just pick him because he's handsome and he kind of fits the bill of what the people think they want, right? So Saul goes along, and pretty soon he falls prey to the fear of man. So you guys understand when I say fear of man what I mean? He cares more about pleasing man and getting the praise of man than he does about trusting and obeying God and getting the praise of God. So Saul gets us, sin. We all get into a lot of trouble. But Saul gets the Hebrews into a lot of people, and he does some really stupid things. And finally, God says, enough. Samuel, I want you to go and anoint another king. So he sends him to this family of Jesse. Jesse's the dad, and Jesse has, was it 7 sons or 8 sons? 7? Yeah. He has a lot of sons. So Samuel goes to Jesse's house, and he's like, hey, bring out your sons. And I'm sure Jesse's like, oh, something good could be up. This is Samuel. Wah! It would be like Billy Graham coming to your house. It's like, wow, this is going to be super exciting. So he lines up all the sons, and Samuel says, surely this is the one. And God says, nope. Surely this is the one. Nope. Surely this is the one. Nope. All the way down the line. However, the youngest son is missing. And Samuel says, well, if it's none of these, Lord, what's the problem here? And he's like, are you missing any sons here? Oh, well, we have little David, but he's a shepherd. He's out in the field tending sheep. God says, go get him. Through Samuel, he says to Sam. Yeah, through Samuel, go get him. So they bring in David, and David is quite young, and he's ruddy, but he probably stinks because he's been living out with the sheep. And God says, this is the man. And there's this beautiful lesson that comes out, and this is one of the ways that God reveals more about himself to us. Because he says to Samuel, you're looking on the things of outward appearance. You're looking for the things that man admires, but I look on the heart. And this shepherd boy, David, has the kind of heart that I'm after. So David is anointed the future king of Israel, okay? And after that, David's taken to the palace, and he's got a crown put on him, and everything is easy for him, right? No. That's not what happens. I'm sorry to tell you that basically David undergoes like 14, 15 years of trial and persecution. Now, why would God do that? Has he ever said to you, or you felt like his Holy Spirit was saying to you, I want you to do this. I'm calling you to do this. And you think, oh, that's great. That's exciting. And then all of a sudden, all these trials come. I can tell you, for our team, we've been planning WOW for about a year. And I can tell you, boy, have we faced trial after trial after trial. And I'm not comparing us to King David. I'm not. But there sometimes is a pattern, because there's the call of God, and then there's the preparation. There's a preparation time. And in that time of preparation, it's often very, very hard. But when we go through trials, we're made stronger, right? We become people of character and people of faith. And then after the preparation time is largely done, I don't think it's ever completely done, right? Then there's the release. And there came a point in time where God releases David. After Saul becomes this crazy king, and he tries to kill David over and over and over again. And at some point, Saul is taken out, and really in part because of his own sin and his own foolishness. And David is now put on the throne, and David becomes the golden king in the golden era of Israel's history. And this is when we have the United Kingdom. At this point, the 12 tribes are united, and they become a nation, okay? This has actually happened under Saul, but under David, they extend their borders. David is a good and righteous king, and it really is the golden years of Israel. Now, David, however, being human, just like you and you and you and you and you and me, he gets bored with all of his success. And in the spring, back in those days, in the spring, most of the kings of nations would go out to war, right? Well, David was enjoying his successes. He's like, oh, you guys just go out to war, and I'll just go up to the rooftop. So he goes up to the rooftop, and he looks down and he sees this woman named, and Bathsheba is married and taking a bath. And he doesn't turn away. He doesn't discipline himself. And he goes, oh, I need her. Bring woman to me, right? So they bring Bathsheba to the king, and he sleeps with her, and he gets her pregnant. And by the way, her husband, who's a very righteous man, is out fighting. And David's like, oh, crumb. What am I going to do now? Bring him back and have him sleep with his wife so it looks like he got her pregnant. Well, the man's so honorable that he won't do it, right? I'm really getting into the weeds here, but this is just such a remarkable story. So, anyway, sadly, because David's manipulative plan doesn't work, because of her husband's righteousness, David actually has him murdered to cover up his own sin. Enter the role of the prophet, Nathan. Now, concurrent with the United Kingdom, and then we're going to talk about the divided kingdom next, there's also these prophets that are being very decisively used by God. And the prophets become God's mouthpiece to speak very largely to these kings. And God is extending mercy and giving kings direction through these prophets, through these righteous prophets. So Nathan comes in and he confronts David, and David ends up repenting, and Bathsheba does have a baby, and the baby dies, right? So consequences. Now, so this is United Kingdom. 12 tribes are unified. David is, for the most part, a really good king, but he blows it in certain areas, okay? So before we get into Solomon, Solomon is a son of David and Bathsheba as well, I think, right? So when we get to Solomon, then we have new problems. So we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. So let's look at our three columns. So how do we see God revealed in the United Kingdom eras, right? So first, he gives Israel a king as they wanted. But so what we learn about God is that sometimes he grants unwise requests to discipline us and to teach us. When we learn to connect foolish decisions, selfish decisions, sinful decisions to bad consequences, what a great opportunity to learn, right? Instead of blaming other people. We see his patience. God allows Saul to remain as king for 20 years. And in that 20-year period, he is preparing David. He's being a very patient father in God. We see that God values humility in his choosing of the little shepherd boy, David, replacing the tall and handsome Saul, right? So we know he values humility. We see forgiveness through the whole story of David and Bathsheba. But even when God forgives, he doesn't necessarily take away the consequences. The consequences usually remain, and it doesn't mean that he doesn't love us. But if we don't have bad consequences, how do we learn, right? If your child or your grandchild is constantly stealing cookies out of the cookie jar and then saying, I don't want dinner, I'm not hungry, there's got to be consequences, right? Or they're going to keep stealing from the cookie jar, right? It's just basic love. We see that God is still keeping covenant. He's still a covenant God. And in this era, he makes yet another covenant called the Davidic covenant. And it's beautiful to read about in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So read about that. Through the United Kingdom, we see God train up leaders and prepare them for tasks that are equal to their faithfulness, right? We know biblically, to whom much is given, much will be required. But only he who is faithful in little will be faithful in much. We see this principle come through loud and clear in this era. We see accountability for actions. And the more authority, the more gifting that God gives a person, the greater the accountability, right? The greater the consequences the harder the discipline. We learned that from Moses, right? Well, we're learning it again from David, and then we're going to learn it. We learn it from Saul, and we're going to learn it from Solomon. So the rebellion of man, well, we see that man has rejected God as their king and seeks a human king instead. So that's pretty clear rebellion. We see that Saul tries to murder David because Saul's jealous, right? Not a good thing. We see that in this era, even though God gave King David great military success and they expanded their borders, eventually David's going to lose focus because of comfort and wealth. I think we can all think of examples of people that lose focus, they lose purpose, they lose this righteous, moral, godly compass because they've been given too much. They've gotten comfortable, they've gotten wealthy. Maybe things have become super easy for them. Maybe that's you at some point in your life, okay? Let's see. We see David as a really weak father. He's not good about disciplining his children, and because of that, his entire kingdom suffers. I'm not even going to get into that nasty stuff. And then how do we see God redeem man back to himself? Well, we see it first and foremost by his raising up of this young shepherd boy, David, who's called a man after God's own heart. And we know that through David's line, God would bring the Messiah 1,000 years later, which is pretty cool. And God promises that that's going to happen. We even see through wicked King Saul, God blesses King Saul with his son named Jonathan. And because of Jonathan, David's life is spared. David would have been murdered by Jonathan's dad, Saul, except Jonathan intervened and saved David's life. So even though his father be wicked and corrupt, through this righteous son named Jonathan, God helps preserve David and the Davidic dynasty. Okay? Now, before we switch over, I have to introduce Solomon to you. So Solomon starts out really, really well. Solomon is David's son, and God says, I want the kingdom to pass to Solomon. Solomon starts out well, and God says, I'm pleased with you, Solomon. Ask me for anything that you want. And what does Solomon say? Give me wisdom so that I might lead your people, God. It's beautiful. And God says, I'm so pleased with your answer. I'm going to give you more than wisdom. I'm going to give you wealth and fame and favor. And he starts out really, really well. But then Solomon, like I was just talking about, he doesn't do well with all of this fame and fortune. And all these enemy nations start, the practice back then, to honor a new king of a thriving, more dominant kingdom, the practice was that a king from another nation would come and present their daughter to become a wife, not the wife, a wife to the king of the prospering nation. So lots of foreign nations brought their daughters to become married to Solomon. And Solomon didn't refuse, okay? Now, just because you see the practice of many wives in Scripture does not mean that God condoned it. He never did. It was ancient practice, and it just was a reality, okay? One of the things I love about the Bible is there's no trying to hide the sin of man, okay? But what happens is Solomon becomes known for the 3 W's, okay? Solomon and the 3 W's. Wisdom, which God gave him in abundance. Wealth, lots and lots and lots of wealth, in part through taxation of his people. And wives. Do you know how many wives and concubines this man ended up having? 1,000. 1,000. It was something like, and I forget which was which, but something like 300 wives and 700 concubines. I mean, that's a lot of women for one man. Yeah. So this leads to his downfall. These 1,000 wives, many from other nations that were idol worshipers, dilute his faith and eventually destroy his faith. And he starts Solomon as king, he's one of the wealthiest men on the earth at that point, maybe even the wealthiest, some people think. He starts building statues of idols inside the palace to satisfy his wife. So it's just like, now you'd think he would have learned from the period of the Judges, but he didn't. Unfortunately, because of this leads to our next section. Oh, we got to talk about how we see Jesus revealed in the United Kingdom before I move on. So how do we see Jesus revealed? Well, through the young David, we see this loving, brave, courageous, and obedient shepherd. I didn't even mention the whole David and Goliath episode, okay? He takes out this wicked Philistine named Goliath, and in that, David becomes a type for Jesus. David is used by God to cut off the head of this ominous enemy, this giant that everybody was intimidated by, and he defeats him. And we know from going back to Genesis 3:16 that God had promised that someday the seed of Eve, Jesus, would fatally wound the enemy. So it all ties together. All right? We see David was a good shepherd. That was one of the reasons that God picked him. And going back to last week, we talked about how in the burning bush, God says to Moses, I am that I am. And then we talked about how that points to John, the Gospel of John, and the 7 I ams. Well, one of the 7 I ams in the Gospel of John is, I am the good shepherd. David was a good shepherd, yes, but I am the ultimate, perfect, and eternal good shepherd. Let's see. Okay, I think that's enough about how we see Jesus revealed in the United Kingdom. So, Solomon now sets us up for the divided kingdom. So, let me give you some context for the divided kingdom. All right? So, here's some factors that lead to the split of the unified nation, where we go from a united kingdom to a divided kingdom. And I'm going to explain more about this in a few minutes. But here are some factors that lead to this, okay? So there was selfish taxation from the south because the kingdom, under the United Kingdom, the kingdom was all centered in southern Israel. And they were taxing all 12 of the tribes. And they were doing so that the king could live a pretty lavish lifestyle and there could be a pretty opulent temple, okay? So selfish taxation to maintain lavish lifestyles. There were tensions between the northern Israel, and the south, which is called Judah, right? There was a lot of jealousy that was continuing on for the time of the judges, and that had not been resolved. And then there was a relocation of the capital city into Judah, which was away from the north. And the greatest population, most of the people of Israel lived in the north, but they relocated the temple to the south, okay? So that puts more of a burden on the northern tribes to worship. Now, this is a little bit weeds, but I think it's important. There's this thing called central sanctuary, and we find that this was commanded by God in Deuteronomy. Let's see, I think Deuteronomy chapter 12. Yeah, Deuteronomy chapter 12. And basically, the principle of central sanctuary means there's one God. Okay, we're a monotheistic religion. Central sanctuary means that we go to where God is. And as a holy, righteous God, God is symbolized, and his presence is symbolized as dwelling in the temple of that day. Now, what was happening is that these pagan nations were influencing Israel to be polytheistic, to worship idols. So they started saying, oh, well, let's just set up a sanctuary up here. Let's set up a temple up here. And they started setting up other temples in other parts of Israel, because it's kind of like, well, we'll just make God come to us. Big violation of the principle of one God. You come to me to worship me. I don't just show up where you want to conveniently set up a temple or a sanctuary. Do you understand this? Now, this is really big in this time period because there was clear violation going on of the principle of central sanctuary. People were saying, oh, let's just set up this little area of worship here, and you go up to here, and you go up to there, and we want to make it really convenient for you guys. We don't want you to have to buy a United Airlines ticket and fly down to Jerusalem, right? We want you just to be able to go wherever. But God needed them to always know there's only one God. So symbolically and metaphorically, you all come as a nation, as one people, to me in what I have designated as the temple. Okay? So that was beginning to be a problem. Now, so the main factor that sets us up for the divided kingdom is Solomon's sin with women and idol worship. Okay? So what happens then? Solomon has a son named, okay, get ready. This is so confusing. His son is Rehoboam. Say it with me, Rehoboam. Rehoboam, okay? Now, there was a servant of Solomon called Jeroboam. Say it with me, Jeroboam. Okay, so the people are getting really ticked off up here in the United Kingdom to Rehoboam because he basically doesn't take the advice of the elders and the prophets that say, hey, back off on this taxation stuff that your dad started because you're really ticking the people off. He's like, no, I'm not. In fact, I'm going to tax them even more. He's super arrogant. He's very young. So he enrages the people even more. And the people of the north go, war. We're going to declare war. There's going to be a mutiny because we're not putting up with this. So they basically take Jeroboam, this courageous military leader who's also a servant of Solomon, and say, you're going to be our new king. So they form this new kingdom in the north that is called Israel. It's a little confusing, but they become called. Okay, I can get this out. They become the kingdom of Israel. They're called the kingdom of Israel. And it's made up of the northern 10 tribes, okay? Now, because these people have split off, Rehoboam says, okay, well, we'll take the surviving tribes, which is only 2, and we'll be called the kingdom of Judah because his family is out of the line of Judah. And by the way, what line does Jesus come from? Yeah, this is in the line of David. It's all in the line of Judah. And Judah is one of the southern tribes, okay? So this sets up what we call the Davidic dynasty. And from this point on, we now have 2 separate kingdoms. The kingdom of the south, the kingdom of the north. Judah versus Israel, okay? And unfortunately, this starts a whole nother downward spiral in Israel's history, okay? Now, what's interesting between the 2 dynasties, this is what we find. Let me find my notes here. Okay, so the northern kingdom lasts about 200 years, and they have 19 kings and 9 different dynasties. That means 9 different families step in to lead this kingdom. They definitely are more evil. They're more selfish. We start to see a lot of assassinations happening here, okay? Not one of the 19 kings that we will see in the northern kingdom fully obey God. Not one. Not one. Now, they just keep encouraging spiritual corruption. They basically give rise to false prophets. They basically encourage prophets that will say what the kings want to hear, okay? Now, in contrast, Judah in the south always stays in the Davidic family. They never have a king on the throne that's not out of the line of David. They last 345 years, okay? They have 20 kings, And 8 out of the 20 obeyed the covenant law and obeyed God. Now, that's less than 50%, but it's better than none in the north, right? Now, what's really interesting about the north versus the south, so geographically, if I drew a big picture of all the tribes of Israel, it would be kind of oblong like this, right? So in the north, they had far greater of the landmass because they were made up by 10 tribes, right? And they happened to be geographically along a major trade route in the world. So they were much more prosperous and therefore more desirable to be attacked by enemy nations. So even though they were way more prosperous, they were way more wealthy, they got attacked constantly to take their resources. And because they were on these trade routes. And trade routes were super vital to the survival of a nation in the ancient world. Okay? Now, down here in the south, they were more up in the hills. They weren't off any major trade routes. They weren't deemed to, they weren't believed by the world to have a lot of really desirable resources. So they weren't attacked as much. So sometimes what the world thinks is a bad thing is actually a good thing, right? Now, let's talk about what happens here, or how do we see God revealed during this era. So when I wrote this many years ago, the Bob Dylan song came into mind. You gotta serve somebody. You guys know that song? It might be the devil or it might be the Lord, but you gotta serve somebody. Serve somebody, right? You guys know that song? If you don't, you gotta look it up. It's a great song. But he's right. He's right. Every one of us, we have to serve somebody. And really, it's either gonna be the devil or it's gonna be the Lord. There ain't no in between. There ain't no in between. Okay, you may think, people might think, well, I can just be an agnostic and just kind of do whatever. But all of us are going to serve somebody, even if it's just ourselves, okay? And if it's anything but God, it's from evil, okay? So we see God reveal that very clearly. You got to serve somebody. And if you, like the northern kings, choose to serve wealth, fame, making alliances with enemy nations that God tells them clearly not to do, well, you're serving the devil and you're going to pay the consequences. But like 8 of the 20 kings of Judah, if you want to serve me, God says, then I'm going to protect you and I'm going to give you favor. And they end up lasting a lot longer than the northern kingdom. Now, when the northern kingdom is destroyed by this invading country of Assyria, they come in and take them over. They never come back. That's the end of this kingdom. Judah, however, they're going to be disciplined. They're going to be attacked by the Babylonian Empire, and they will be sent into captivity for 70 years, but they're going to come back. So the kingdom of Judah survives. Now, this is largely in part because of the Abrahamic covenant and the Davidic covenant. And in fact, all the covenants that God has made heretofore, because he says, I will preserve you, and David, you will always have an heir on the throne. And that goes all the way to Jesus, right? So even though they're disciplined, God still preserves them, and Jesus comes out of this nation, out of the nation of Judah. Okay, so let's go further down about how God reveals himself to man in this era. Okay. So we see that God will not tolerate shared worship. That's one of the 10 commandments. Worship me and worship me only. Now, is that because God's narcissistic? No. God, he just is. I am that I am. There's only one true God. He doesn't want people to go on this fantasy thing of worshiping other idols, whether it's your own wealth or how you want to look physically or how you want to be perceived. He knows all of that's going to lead to heartache and disappointment. If our idol is money, how much is enough? It's never enough. Somebody once asked J. Paul Getty, Mr. Getty, how much is enough money? And his answer was, just a little bit more. We don't want to fall into that trap. Okay, we see that God reveals himself as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He is King of kings and Lord of lords, and he will not share his glory. He begins to speak through his prophets during this time period. We see Elijah and Elisha, those prophets, enter the scene at this point. And again, we see God is willing to speak through imperfect humanity to reveal himself to the human race. He loves through discipline. He allows the nation to go into captivity in hopes of regaining their heart. And indeed, that is what happens in the future when God sends Judah into captivity. He doesn't destroy them. He just lets them go into captivity for only 70 years. 70 years is actually a pretty short time period. When you go to Europe and you stand in front of buildings or statues in Europe that have been there longer than the United States was even a thought, it makes you realize we're a really young nation. And because of that, we sometimes have a hard time grasping how quickly time goes and how short 100 years is. 100 years is not that much. Okay, we see tough love. God reveals himself through tough love. He gives great challenges to different kings to bring them back to himself. An example is King Uzziah. He gives him leprosy to humble him and to bring Uzziah back to God. And then I talked about central sanctuary. God reminds us through central sanctuary that he will not be manipulated by man. God is only one God, and he is sovereign over man. Now, how do we see the rebellion of man? Well, definitely through good old Rehoboam. He's foolish. He continues in his father's way and actually goes further down the spiral of foolishness and selfishness. And he ends up being very responsible for a lot of discipline that comes to the people of Judah. We see that a lot of the kings exploit the people to support a lavish lifestyle. We see in this time period that the poor are not taken care of. Oftentimes widows are not taken care of, but the kings are living this lavish, selfish lifestyle. When Jeroboam becomes the new king over the north, he's put there by God's favor and by God's design. But Jeroboam soon builds 2 new temples in the north. And he knows it's in direct violation of central sanctuary. And guess what he does at both of those temples? He puts a golden calf in each one of them. For heaven's sake. Do they not remember what happened when Aaron allowed that to happen when they were in the desert in Sinai? It's ridiculous. Now, sadly, because there was so much punishment from God for Jeroboam building these 2 new sanctuaries or 2 new temples and putting these golden calves in them, this becomes known as the sin of Jeroboam. And when we're reading through the Old Testament during the divided kingdom, you're going to see the phrase, the sin of Jeroboam, mentioned over and over and over again. And it's directly referring to what he did. Great punishment came to all of his people because of that. Idol worship becomes the nation's biggest temptation and threat to their ultimate ruin. They didn't learn from their ancestors. Okay? This era is replete with kings leading their nations into great sin and idol worship. They keep taking foreign wives. Some of you have heard of Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab's a king. Jezebel was bad news. Really bad. Really, really, really bad. Well, if he had just simply obeyed God and not taken any foreign wives, Jezebel wouldn't have been part of the picture. Jezebel is the one that ends up sending the prophet Elijah running for his life. She's bad. If anyone ever calls you a Jezebel, it's not a compliment. Yeah, it's not a compliment. They kept making alliances with enemy pagan nations. They said, okay, we're going to trust these enemy nations to protect us when other conquerors come against us. And God is saying, no, trust me. I will protect you. And when the kings trust God and turn to God, God does protect them. But when they make alliances with enemy nations, God allows those conquerors to come in and whoop up on them. You read it over and over and over again. I mean, at some point you go, my gosh, are these people stupid? It's, do you think he ever says that about us? Possibly. They didn't keep their covenant stipulations, and it brought great, great consequences. So, redemption of man back to God. Well, we see, and I just mentioned this, one of the ways that God redeems man in his rebellion back to himself is by allowing enemy nations to come in and beat up on him, because they have to be in pain to come to repentance. You do recognize that, right? For us to truly come to repentance, it usually involves pain. It usually involves suffering. I don't know about you, but a lot of times I'm not too motivated to make good changes in my life until I'm hurting. And then I'm motivated all of a sudden to change my diet or to change my disciplines or to be nicer to someone in my family. When they say, you've really hurt me, and that breaks my heart, that motivates me to change. Maybe you're like I am. When righteous kings obeyed and revered God, he miraculously protected, delivered, and provided for their nations. And again, this was more often in Judah and very rarely in Israel. So, how do we see Jesus revealed in this era? Well, he is our righteous, humble, and eternal and reigning King of Kings. Unlike almost every kings of this era, especially in the north, that were wicked, selfish, disobedient. Jesus, in the opposite spirit, gives himself, dies on the cross for our sin. We see that Jesus comes as a servant leader. What did he do with his disciples the night before he gets sent to all the trials that happen? Yeah, Jesus washes their feet. I'm sure you know that's reserved from the lowest of the low of servants. Some servants in that day, if their master would say, wash my guest's feet, some servants would say, no, that's beneath me. No, not beneath Jesus. Complete opposite spirit of the kings and leaders of that time. We see that Jesus is the king, the prophesied king of the tribe of Judah. He is the Lion of Judah that is prophesied during this time. And even when the kingdom of Judah is basically exiled into captivity over into Babylon's over here. So if this was a nation of Israel, Assyria's up here to the north and they come down and take the north. Babylon's over here to the right. They come over here and take Judah and bring them over to Babylon. Even during the Babylonian exile, we still know that God has promised to deliver them. And indeed, he does through the Lion of Judah. Okay? Now, just some little helpful things that will help you with this era. So, and you can just make notes here. So, this era of history is covered through 1st and 2nd Kings and through 1st and 2nd Chronicles, okay? And it's helpful to understand that 1st and 2nd Kings basically cover the kingdoms of both the north and the south, okay? And it covers Solomon's reign to the exile, okay, to when they're exiled to Babylon. Now, first, did you guys all get that? So 1st and 2nd Kings covers both kingdoms, all right? 1st and 2nd Chronicles is recording the same time period, but with a different focus. First and Second Chronicles just focuses on the kingdom of Judah, and it just focuses on the Davidic dynasty. It just focuses on seeing how the line of Judah carries down through David, and it covers from David as king through King Cyrus of Persia, when the captives are allowed to return. Okay? So we have covered a lot today. I know there might be some questions. So what questions do you have?